After America is made on the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis, and this is After America. In Minneapolis last week, an Immigration and Customs Enforcement officer shot and killed mother of three, Renee Nicole Good. The Trump administration immediately blamed Good, calling it an act of domestic terrorism. But videos of the incident show that it was nothing of the sort. Good was turning her car away from the officer, who wasn't injured. The killing was appalling, but not surprising. The administration is now doubling down, portraying Good as a gender and race traitor.
Everybody who's been repeating the lie that this is some innocent woman who was out for a drive in Minneapolis when a law enforcement officer shot at her, you should be ashamed of yourself.
I understand that Vice President Vance believes that shooting a young mother of three in the face 3 times is an acceptable America that he wants to live in, and I do not. And that is a fundamental difference between Vice President Vance and I. I do not believe that the American people should be assassinated in the street. Thank you.
But these are professional agitators, and law enforcement should not be in a position where they have to put up with this stuff.
Misogyny and blood and soil style nationalism infuse everything the Trump administration is doing.
An ICE recruitment ad featuring the turn of phrase, "We'll have our home again," plastered over an image of a man on horseback and a stealth bomber flying in the distance. That's a reference to the song "We'll Have Our Home Again," a white supremacist anthem favored by the Proud Boys. Trump supporter and billionaire Elon Musk wrote 100 above this message on X, which read in part, quote, "If white men become a minority, we will be slaughtered. White solidarity is the only way to survive."
And the violence is only escalating, at home and abroad. After creating a power vacuum in Venezuela, after kidnapping President Maduro, reports emerged that armed militias had started stopping and searching vehicles in Caracas for US citizens. This was entirely predictable. Since then, Trump has reportedly asked military leaders to draw up plans for an invasion of Greenland. He's threatened Colombia, Cuba, Canada, Panama, and is clearly leaning towards military intervention in Iran. The consequences of all of this are catastrophic. But over the weekend, Australia's outgoing ambassador to the United States, Kevin Rudd, posted on Twitter that the Australia-US alliance has never been stronger. Joining us this week to talk about all of this and more is Professor Elizabeth N Saunders. Elizabeth is Professor of Political Science at Columbia University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She's the author of The Insider's Game: How Elites Make War and Peace. I wanted to start with maybe the most immediate news, especially for the domestic United States, and that's with those just appalling scenes in Minneapolis, in Minnesota. Protests have swelled in response and seem to be growing. What do you make of it all?
Well, not a whole lot shocks me anymore, especially after January 6th, which I think was really a pretty sharp break even from the first Trump administration. But Minneapolis was really shocking. And I think the video made it both clear, but also some of the both sidesing in the news media that we saw afterwards. I don't know how much of that is filtered down to you, but that was also shocking. I mean, it feels a little bit like we are experiencing regime change at home and regime change abroad in Venezuela, and the power of the Trump administration, though there are good arguments to be made that these are signs of weakness, right? This is what weak, strong men do. It's also hard to not to feel like the damage being done and the damage that the administration still could do is incalculable, in part because they still have control over so many levers of power. So it was a dizzying week to go from Venezuela to Greenland to Minneapolis, and it all feels like it's stemming from the same sort of chaotic cruelty that has become a hallmark of the second term.
Yeah, chaotic cruelty is a really apt way to describe it. And I want to come back, of course, to Venezuela and your mention of weakness there. Maybe one of the threads that connects that is Trump's use of executive power and his consolidation of executive power that we've talked about a lot. That seems to also apply to Minnesota in the way that the administration is refusing to allow the state, for example, to be part of the investigation into the killing. How is that playing out at home, this battle between states' rights and federal rights?
So on a number of levels, it's both shocking and kind of, as an intellectual problem, interesting, but one doesn't really think, I mean, not that that's remotely as important, but I think in trying to sort out what's unique about this, I think one of the things we learned in the first Trump administration is just how much of American democracy, like other, democracies, the UK doesn't have a written constitution, for example, rests on norms and guardrails that are not written down anywhere. So you could say it's not illegal, but it's tradition or something like that, right? And a lot of the law, especially when it comes to the intersection of state and federal prosecutions, is quite similar. So I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough to know that in a normal investigation of this type, which is a really difficult to prosecute a law enforcement officer is really difficult in the US to begin with, under any circumstances. And we've seen this over and over and over again over the decades. So that's not new. But typically you would have a crime scene secured, you would have cooperation between state and local authorities, they would all be involved. There might be a turf war, there might be a jurisdictional battle, but you wouldn't have the complete cutoff of the state authorities from the evidence at the federal level. But that's not really written down anywhere as far as I'm aware. And so it's yet another norm that they've just done away with. And that's happening more and more serious, egregious ways, which makes the people who were sounding the alarm over less dramatic breaches of norms look pretty prescient, right? So I think what's happened in this very specific case is tragic, cruel. One could come up like there's a litany of adjectives that come to mind, but I think that the one immediate feeling in the aftermath is, okay, if they can do this, what else are they going to try? And it does feel a little bit like we have departed into a new universe of domestic law and order. And I have friends in Minneapolis who are feeling very, they're hunkered down. And when I talked to you last, I had just come to Australia for a week in a workshop, and it was right after the National Guard had deployed in DC, and it definitely felt strange. But the National Guard, it must be said, I would see them all the time on the metro. My oldest child would see them on riding the metro for after school and so forth. They were unfailingly polite. They never had masks on. They had their names and their, identification. You knew who they were, and they weren't trying to hide. They were pretty much just there. Sometimes you would see them looking kind of sheepish, like, what are we doing here? They are not really the source of this problem. This is ICE and people who sort of signed up to do this specific kind of work, and it's making it feel really, really uncomfortable. And that's also happening on the streets of DC, less so than it was, but in part because they've moved ICE around into so many different places. But I think the unease that those deployments over the summer and the ICE activity in Los Angeles sort of engendered across the country is now really coming home.
Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem says hundreds more federal agents are being sent to Minnesota to support the thousands already on the ground.
Well, this is a massive increase, John, because this was already the largest immigration action to date.
People need to quit demonstrating, quit yelling at law enforcement, challenging law enforcement, and begin to get civil. And until we do that, we're going to have we're going to have it this way.
Tonight, there's an FBI investigation investigation into the incident, but at least 3 prosecutors in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota have resigned over their concerns with the direction of the investigation, a source familiar with the resignations told NBC News. And a federal law enforcement source tells NBC News those resignations were triggered in part by Justice Department leadership pressure to investigate Good and her widow's connections to activist groups.
I mean, it seems like the administration actively wants to escalate that situation. You know, Kristi Noem is saying that they're going to send hundreds more ICE officers into Minnesota. I mean, from the outside, it looks like they want violence to escalate. They particularly are looking for violence to escalate against ICE agents so that they can then crack down harder. And I mean, you mentioned, of course, that nobody knows what's going to happen next, and nobody can know that. But people in the administration, like Stephen Miller, have been signaling for quite a while that they would like to invoke the Insurrection Act, for example. Do you think that's still a possibility?
I mean, I think anything is a possibility. As I say, after January 6th, I vowed I would never say I was surprised. I mean, I was definitely surprised when I woke up on that Saturday morning that they had extracted Nicolas Maduro overnight from his compound, right? I mean, I think the timing and nature of that was a surprise, but the fact that he'd acted against Maduro was not a surprise.
Yeah.
So nothing really would surprise me. Miller has been quite open about it. I like to think there are still some lines that Republicans in Congress wouldn't cross. There aren't many. They acquitted him of, at his impeachment trial for January 6th. So again, nothing would surprise me. I do think that images of firing on protesters, maybe that's a Rubicon they wouldn't cross. But I do think that there is a tug of war between different factions of the administration, right? There's no one single Trump administration. And what ends up happening in one day to the next is often a function of which side Trump sides with. And what's interesting is I think Stephen Miller may view the Venezuela operation as a way of justifying a wartime footing. So for him, these things are linked because if you're fighting a war, you can claim powers at home. We saw this after 9/11. And yet the posture of the administration after Maduro's arrest was this was a law enforcement operation, not a wartime. And that's kind of the Marco Rubio faction that was just more interested in getting rid of Maduro and maybe turning to Cuba. So I keep bringing up Venezuela because I think all of this is of a piece. Like these things are not independent, right? It's a lot of pulling guns on people. But I do, not that the legal justifications or their rhetoric is constraining them much, right? I mean, they apparently rationalized the legality of that operation after the fact with some memo, and it used to be you had to do the memo first, right? But they fired a lot of the military lawyers for precisely this reason, right? There may be a point where if they want to go further, they're going to have to just declare that they don't care, right? That they're going to have to just say, okay, well, we are invoking the Insurrection Act, and what we did in Venezuela was actually war and not a law enforcement operation. And, or we can say whatever we want about it now because you can't stop us. And I think one of the problems with, there's a running argument that you see on social media in the US right now between people who are really optimistic because they see this as sort of the lashing out of a cornered animal, right? Who's really losing power, has suffered serious electoral defeats, serious setbacks in the courts, a lot of protests and, individual people standing up to the administration, juries, all kinds of constraint that is real. And that's sort of on the one hand, and others who sort of view the damage and the potential damage that still could come and aren't as optimistic, or at least think even if the system prevails in the long run, we still have a lot of damage left to witness. And I think I sort of come down somewhere in between, right? I do think that some of the constraints are real. The victories are real. Like I don't think we should be doomerists because I think that is what is sustaining like the push to impose and enforce existing constraints, right? I mean, this isn't about taking down Trump. This is just about enforcing rules that have been on the books, right? And norms of decency and humanity. But on the other hand, there is this sort of way in which they break the rules, get told they broke the rules by a judge or some other, and then, but it's just the damage is done. It can't really be enforced, right? And so the break it first and apologize later, or don't apologize at all, to me, it weakens some of the constraints. The courts just can't move that fast. And there have even been cases where they have moved fast and the administration has simply ignored them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking back to the deportations early on of Kilmar Garcia Abrego, a Maryland man who they deported over a judge's objection, et cetera. So it's a bit hard to maintain the optimism, but I think there is reason to be a little more optimistic in the long run, maybe, than when we spoke last, in part because of the elections that happened in between.
Mm-hmm.
But so much of what's happening now is, they've broken the glass and then they get told to sort of unbreak it. And that's not so easy to do.
Yeah, but they've demolished the East Wing of the White House. You can't. It's gone.
Exactly. I feel like the metaphor of the East Wing of the White House sort of sums the whole thing.
Yeah, I think so too. How do you think that all plays out? Obviously, this is very unpredictable, as you say, but how do you think that all plays out with Greenland? Because it seems like they're going after it. That's what they're signaling, and that this is how they do things. They normalize that kind of attack with Venezuela, and then they talk about it on national broadcasters. They talk back to Trump and talk him into it. Like, that seems the way that this is heading.
Yeah, I mean, the very first boat they deployed to Venezuela, a colleague who studies Latin America sent me the news link and said, "Wait, are we threatening Venezuela?" And I said, no, of course not. This is just performative, Boy, have I learned my lesson, right? And it no longer, by the time it actually happened, only the manner and the timing were a surprise, right? Whereas if he'd done this, you can't do something like this really out of the blue, but he gradually, we were all kind of boiling frogs on Venezuela, right? The frog in the boiling water. And so I think that has sobered everybody to the return of this Greenland. We must have Greenland.
We are going to do something on Greenland, whether they like it or not, because if we don't do it, Russia or China will take over Greenland, and we're not going to have Russia or China as a neighbor.
We are now facing a geopolitical crisis, and if we have to choose between the United States and Denmark here and now, we choose Denmark.
We had what I will describe as a frank but also constructive discussion. The discussions focused on how to ensure the long-term security in Greenland. And here our perspectives continue to differ, I must say.
Germany has announced it will send troops to Greenland for the first time, along with other European countries. It's part of measures to boost defense on the Arctic island, as U.S. President Donald Trump insists the Danish territory is essential for U.S. national security.
Greenland is very important for the national security, including of Denmark. And the problem is there's not a thing that Denmark can do about it if Russia or China wants to occupy Greenland. But there's everything we can do. You found that out last week with Venezuela.
I mean, I think the rhetoric is more than rhetoric. I think you have to take it seriously, just like you have to take the threats against Canada seriously. It still seems like an awful lot of effort to get something you could pretty much already have for free, right? And if you, free as in you don't have to take it over by force, or even purchase it, and then, it's not just the purchase, it's the administering of it, right? I mean, from a purely mercenary financial standpoint, it's far more efficient for the U.S. to have Greenland administered by either itself or by Denmark, right? I mean, having to administer another territory is expensive, especially when it's done under duress, where you risk some kind of, revolt or something like that. But, do you really want to have to set up U.S. courts in Greenland? Like, it seems like an awful lot of bother. And so I come back, because it's just so strategically and materially nonsensical, I come back to, he wants his own Louisiana Purchase, or, a giant part of the map that he saw in the Mercator projection and thinks Greenland is bigger than it is. I mean, the best argument, I guess, is Arctic access and minerals. But again, there's nothing you couldn't get out of that through negotiation. So maybe it ends with, even if he means it now, maybe it ends with a hardball tactics against Denmark and they negotiate a new deal, which I don't even think would take much hardball. I mean, Denmark seems perfectly willing. I mean, it's not as though they're not aware of Russian threats in Europe, right? But one wonders why so much effort on Greenland to counter this Russian threat, but not in Ukraine, right? I mean, none of it doesn't hang together in any, and we should all know better than to look for too much logic. But even by Trumpian standards, this is quite illogical. So, but not would anything in Greenland surprise me? Absolutely not.
I mean, you yourself have used the phrase shocking but not surprising, and I think that applies to everything. And I think you're right. Searching for rationality can be a futile exercise. Like, I think maybe it is just as simple as Trump wants that. He wants to be emperor. He wants that victory. Like, this is kind of imperial machismo, and that's it. That's what it is. You mentioned there, though, grappling with this from the other side when you're kind of subject to it is incredibly difficult. And you mentioned Denmark, of course. European leaders seem to be just scrambling, trying to figure out what they're going to do, like gaming out the scenarios. I mean, what can Europe do? Like, is there a scenario in which Europe goes to war with the United States over Greenland? Like, Stephen Miller doesn't seem to think that that's what will happen. But I mean, is he right to be confident?
No, they can't. And I think in that limited sense, he is right. And I think the European leaders are well aware that they are not ready to confront or even act independently of the U.S. And that is what's underpinning this strategy of, Keir Starmer gets a lot of beef for, sucking up to Trump and or flattering him and not confronting him. And everybody wants that scene in Love Actually where the prime minister stands up and and if you don't have the power to back it up, then you're inviting real trouble, right? So I have more sympathy for the European leaders trying to keep Trump on side for Ukraine's sake, for their own sakes, and not wanting to pick a fight. But they are starting to show, there's been some discussion I saw today about, British troops in Greenland.
The French have raised that too.
I do. Yeah. I think there are lines that Trump could cross that would result in they're not going to go to war, but I think that it would accelerate some trends that I don't know if I think it would probably lead to the end of NATO in all but name, if not also in name.
I mean, it has to, surely.
I don't see how NATO survives that. But, Europe is in the middle of a major push to spend a tremendous amount of money on defense. But it's, the reorientation of security policy is there, but it's not going to come to fruition under current circumstances for quite some time. Maybe this really accelerates it. Maybe it gets rid of some of the divisions or obstacles that might be in the way. Trump has tended to be an accelerant that takes trends and just, supercharges them. And if Europe was already going to be heading towards rearmament and acting on its own, this may be, if something happened in Greenland, I think that would probably be the result more than a war. But then the U.S. has to wonder, is that really what the U.S. wants? Because traditionally, the way the U.S. manages NATO is they say the Europeans really have to contribute more. And they really have to stand on their own 2 feet, except when the U.S. wants to tell them what to do, in which case they want to tell them what to do, right? So be careful what you wish for, because if you're the U.S., you might want to tell the Europeans what to do someday.
I'm conscious of time, and there's so much to unpack and so much to cover. But one of the wars that is thinkable in that context, especially in the history of Republican foreign policy, is with Iran. And Trump is now he's talking again as well about striking Iran somehow in support of democratic protests. You've written extensively about regime change and how international relations scholars don't agree on much, but they do agree that regime change does not work. I think we'll see that in Venezuela. But what about in the context of Iran and the possibility of a US intervention there?
So that one is a bit baffling, not least because his own government is firing on protesters in Minneapolis, right? I think a lot of that probably is bluster that's now a scramble to kind of give him options and leak a story about how he's being briefed on options because he said he wanted options. But, if Trump tried to do anything in Iran, it would probably only strengthen the hand of the regime because death to America is the sort of founding slogan of the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution. So it's really hard to imagine a scenario in which, I think what they did in Venezuela was wrong and also strategically not smart, but I can see why. Like I can make a case if I were a Marco Rubio thinking about, I want Maduro gone. This is how I would do it, right? And I would not try and install the opposition. I would, just for stability and so forth, right? I really can't see how any sane advisor would, even a Stephen Miller, who probably doesn't care that much about Iran, it's just hard to imagine, what are they going to tell him to do? It just doesn't. What options are there that are better than allowing the people to handle? They're not going to take out the security forces. That's not, if they want to save the protesters, how are they going to do it? I think Trump has this idea that he has agency everywhere now, that he can affect, he solved 8 wars and, he can solve everything, and military force and bombing is really the tool he he bombed, we've already forgotten, but he bombed Nigeria over Christmas for reasons that nobody still can really ascertain. But I don't, unlike in Venezuela, where I don't think it was so unthinkable that he could have pulled this off, like pulled off the Maduro operation.
Yeah.
Whether you think it's smart or not, it was an option that could have been presented to him. And that doesn't surprise me. I can't even think of what option they would be giving him.
Yeah.
There's no access. It's completely opaque. There's no American. At least there's some American presence in Venezuela still. It's just unclear to me what he could even mean by that.
Well, I think, dropping bombs, as you said.
Yeah, exactly. Doing that. Yeah.
So we've talked about then the potential for deploying the military domestically to suppress protesters. We've talked about Venezuela, Greenland, Nigeria, potentially Iran. That's a lot of deployment and resources. And you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that the potential for this to be interpreted as a sign of weakness. And you've actually written about the possibility of Imperial overstretch, I think is how you described it, or Trump.
Well, that's not my phrase.
Overstretch.
That's I called it Trump overstretch, Trumpian overstretch. But it's a play on a famous historian, Paul Kennedy, who wrote this book, Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And it came out, I think, in 1989, give or take a year. I made my memory, maybe 1987. At the height of concern that the United States was about to experience imperial decline, or, great power decline. And the country everybody was worried about was Japan. So I can remember Made in America ads when I was a kid. And the threat was coming supposedly from Japan, which of course then went into a decade of, economic crisis. So that didn't turn out so well. But I think he's onto something. He was onto something. And I think maybe you can even date it to Iraq. But I think what's different about this is, the Iraq War was certainly imperial overstretch, if such a thing exists, right? But it and Afghanistan at least were kind of one concentrated thing, right? And this is like everything everywhere all at once and without any real strategic planning, and shuttering offices that deal with the Arctic at the same time, right? I mean, just a tremendous amount of shrinking of the resources that you would want to make any of this a success, to the extent it could be a success. So it feels like a very Trumpian version of imperial overstretch, where you just are lashing out in all directions. I sort of think of it as not so much the dominoes falling, which is the way we would describe in the Cold War. If we don't protect this country, the next domino will fall. This is like smashing the domino table, just upending it. And who the heck knows where they will fall?
Yeah, no, nobody knows. But we appreciate you so much, you guiding us through, and your time and your generosity in explaining, what is such a chaotic mess. So thank you, and we hope to speak to you again soon.
Yes, thank you. I hope someday I get to come on and talk about something a little less depressing, but
we'll do our
best. Join you. Yeah, happy to join you anytime.
Thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode. You can save $5 off our latest book, A Time for Bravery, What Happens When Australia Chooses Courage, with the code POD5, that's POD5. The discount is available for a limited time only. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. You can reach us via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Tuesday the 13th of January, Australian time. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week at the regular time of first thing Tuesday morning, Australian Eastern Daylight Time. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.